Hello, this is Al Black and my co-host Tim Conroy.
Hey Al, how you doing?
Great. Chewing the Gristle is a poetry chat. And our guest today is the poet Ellen Kombiyil. Ellen is an author of Histories of the Future Perfect from 2015 and a micro chapbook, Avalanche Tunnel 2016. Recent work has appeared or is forthcoming in the New Ohio Review, Nimrod, North American Review, Salt Hill, the Minnesota Review, and Plowshares. She is a two-time winner of the Mary M. Fay Poetry Award from Hunter College, a recipient of an Academy of American Poets College Prize, and was awarded the Nancy Dean Medieval Prize for an essay on the acoustic quality of Chaucer's poetics. She is a founder of the Great Indian Poetry Collective, a mentorship model press publishing emerging poets from India and the diaspora. A graduate of the University of Chicago and Hunter's MFA program, she currently teaches creative writing at Hunter College. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So we talked just before this. Teaching virtually, you're very used to this Zoom process now.
Just getting used to it. It's still hard.
Ellen, could you tell us about your poetry journey and education? Were you writing poetry in high school and college, and who were your early influences?
I just remember walking home from school and this rhythm, it's kind of like the rhythm of the walking. I don't know if you've ever had that where you just go out and your body moving, and some lines were going through my head and it seemed to build with the walking. And by the time I sort of quickening my pace to get home, and then I got home and just it spilled right out, and then it was this poem. I think it was called Mr. Moon, Mr. Moon, and I wrote it down, and then I used to carry it around in my pocket, all folded up. It was precious, and I've just been writing poetry ever since. It was just something that always was a part of my life. And I think I read a lot of poetry as a child. We all kind of grow up with nursery rhymes and those sort of and songs, but I read a lot of Shel Silverstein. I had all of his books and I would just spend hours reading them. So I think that the language of poetry was just there from a really young age with me. I think I started in college. I was really reading voraciously, and the poets who most influenced me as a young college poet were Rita Dove. I read, every time I would read her books, I would just consume them, and it would just straight through, read it again, and then it would just be one of those books that then it would make you want to write. There's books like that just inspire you to get pen to paper. She was an early influencer, and Susan Mitchell, her book Rapture had just come out when I was, I think I was a second year in college. And that book, just because it's so musical, again, I think it just really made me want to write. And so these are books that I still like to teach from, because they had such a profound impact on me. They still mean a lot to me.
Were you still writing poetry in college? Were you still working on actively writing poetry?
Yeah. So I, at the University of Chicago where I went, we were able to do a senior thesis. If you were getting high enough grades, you could write a thesis for honors, to try to go for honors. So I was in that sort of cohort, and then I didn't really want to write an academic paper. I was much more interested in creative writing. So if you could find somebody to be your sort of mentor. They sort of laid it on you. Like if you could find a faculty member to work with you, then you could propose a project and do it. And so I said I wanted to write like a chapbook of poems. And Elizabeth Alexander was a visiting professor that year. And so I didn't even know her. Like I had never taken her class. You know, she had like it was the old system where you would there was like a mailbox file folder in the faculty lounge in the English department. And I like just wrote a note, like I would like to write a poetry thesis with you. Here's some poems. Like I think I gave her like 6 or 7 poems, and I just put it in the little file folder. And I didn't know what was going to happen. And then she contacted me and said yes. And then we began this process. I met with her. It wasn't weekly. I don't remember. It was a while ago, but it was several times during the semester. We had scheduled meetings. She would look at what I'd been working on, and it was like one-on-one, sort of like what she wanted me to do to keep moving forward. And then the other piece of that was we were each assigned like a graduate student to work with. And that's somebody who I worked with, you know, weekly with a few other people who are also doing poetry theses. And it was Maureen McLean who works at NYU. And so she's also become like a huge poet in her own right, but she was a fantastic grad student. She gave us like tons of reading to do and prompts, and we would meet every week. We would write together. We would share our work. So it was a very nurturing environment at that time. And then I ended up writing this, you know, little chapbook, and that was my graduate thesis.
You know, Ellen, I always ask poets, you know, especially when they've started out, you know, how do you work past mediocrity to get to the level of success you've had? How do you plug on through the frustration of getting better?
That's a really good question. It's something I feel like I talk to my students about a lot right now too. And the real thing is, like, I think I'm kind to myself. I think that's the first thing. You know, like it's really, really like we're perfectionists as poets, I think, because it's such a short form and you've got to get everything right down to the level of the line, the word, the exact sound that you want. And it can become so demanding that you can be really hard on yourself. And you need a little bit of that. It's not like you can, but then at the same time, like I made a pact with myself early on that I would never abandon a poem. That doesn't mean if a poem's not working that, you know, I don't move on from it. That's not what I mean by that. But I mean that every poem is in its own sort of like nesting phase. And some poems, they come out really almost done. And that's the rare, beautiful occurrence. It's so fun. And it's like, oh, I barely have to do anything and it's done. But most of the poems don't work like that. And they're really like this long labor of love. And I've had poems that I've worked on for like a decade, right? That, you know, they don't get finished so quickly or so easily. But it's like, I just let them breathe. They have their own lifespan. And to try to rush it doesn't do service to me, or to just be like, trying to burn the gears through. The poem's not ready. I'm not ready, I think, to really be kind about it.
Well, Ellen, I think maybe we would love to hear some of those poems that have made it through the process and are ready to be heard.
Great. So you want me to read a poem or two?
Yeah, read 2 poems. That would be great.
Okay. So I'll start with, let's see. Love Song with Contradictions. It's sort of one of the newer ones of the manuscript I'm putting together. And it took a while. I remember, I'll just give a little preamble. Like it was one of these poems that I was like, I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to do. And I had this image and I had in my notebook, like write this poem. And I just had like little bullet points and I didn't know how it was going to come together. And this is what finally came out of all of those notes. Okay. Love Song with Contradictions. What were you listening to, great grandma, down at the lake that Saturday night when you felt you couldn't breathe? Not those low riders waxed and raring, the way souped up carburetors suck oxygen to drag along the strip, your gulping breaths, gurgling, ineffective. The ambulance fetched you. In the hospital, they lopped off your thick braids to think you never grayed, for convenience or to ease sweating. Grandma took them home, kept them in a candle box next to her bed. Each night she'd slide back the lid and touch them. The surprise of it, oh, sorting the clutter after the house sold, Ma found them under the sink next to the Brillo pads. It was unexpected, not the way, as a girl, when I first touched myself, thought I'll die from this. More like a child wandering aisles of jarred foods who looks up and can't spot her mother, howls a siren of rage. Love is not a boat moored on a lake that still bobs on waves, more like a house, its foundation drilled into bedrock that in an earthquake still shakes. Can you explain this inheritance? Grandma nodded to her bed so she won't sustain a fracture. Oh, to be found but never claimed, picking bright pink cherries for my drinks because they're sweet. Pay attention, Ma said. Keep up.
Wonderful.
I think that's a lovely poem, Ellen. God almighty. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. So the image that I sort of like wrote down in my notebook was this idea of the braids being found. And then the connection through the lines of the women in the family. So it was the great-grandmother, the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, and how the braids sort of linked them. So I had this idea of, okay, generational and an image, but I didn't know what was going to come out of it. And so that poem went through rounds and rounds and rounds of work to find its voice. You want one more now?
Please.
Okay. Okay, this one is called Love as Invasive Species. And it starts with a little epigraph. And beyond the empty cage, a bedroom. And beyond a bedroom, the wood boards, beams, and floors holding the shape of the house. And beyond the house, a yard. And that's from Jorge Luis Borges' mislaid manuscript, Labyrinthine Architectures. And then the footnote for this poem is that quote and the book is a fictional book. Both of them were made up in service of the poem. So that book doesn't exist. Okay. Love as Invasive Species. The day the tarantula escaped, my uncle joked, the cage is empty. He set it over cornflakes, the rock fallen off, the mesh lid mysteriously askew. He smiled and slurped and chewed. We searched behind the couch cushions, among piano hammers' knotted strings, in the broom closet with its scary duster. How many days has he let it out for a walk, crossing the Afghan's colored squares draped across the backrest? At night, I dreamt it crept across the headboard as I slept, scuttled clacks, each foot a seed-hard talon, spilled tacks. Grandma finally found it when shaking the sheets out. Black and lacy, it sailed through the air, then scampered under the bookshelf where it hid, then disappeared beneath baseboards. The walls breathe with it now, acrid, not unlike the air outside the zoo's tropical house, toucans dripping guano black as the berries they ate. I coax it with felled moths, pheromones exuding from their bungled heads after all night blinging the bulb's sexless filament. Or I stun lightning bugs with a mosquito zapping racket, sweep twitching bodies near the crevice, where I expect long fingers to sense their way out, scoop the offering into its mouth. Or I want it gone, to know it's no longer fingering up the walls, its carcass a dropped glove I'll bury in the yard beside a house quietly erupting, cupboards sagging with china plates, identity papers locked inside a fireproof safe, the last will and testament edited, crossed out, signed in a wavering, unrecognizable hand, the tarantula's carapace slipping off, mushrooms growing where its abdomen once was. the bookshelves collapsing, centipedes and their nymphs thriving amid dusty spines, the loved and unread occupying the same space inside their dead wood frames. The cage is empty. I bring home a mate and watch it sleep under the heat lamp, tap at the glass, hoping in the way scent pervades all available space, I'll find a way to live again, grateful, tame, among the rocks.
That's gorgeous.
Thank you.
Brother Al.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of a tarantula loose in the house. So you have a new project, a new manuscript you're working on. Explain to us about your new project, your manuscript.
Yeah, I think both of these come from that, and it's really tracing this matrilineal lineage that I've really spent my lifetime discovering. Like, you hear stories when you're young, you don't really understand them all, and then as an adult, I would hear little snippets of things. And I started to piece them together. And my grandmother just passed away last year, actually this year in January. And a lot of the things preceding up to her death, some of the stories were coming out, and a lot of the, over the past like 6 years, I was noticing there was this lineage of patterns of mental illness that ran along my family line, and domestic abuse that seemed to be passed down in a way, either through genetically or through learned behaviors of how do we learn to make relationships with people, what feels normalized in a family, seem to be important questions. So as I'm a wife and a mother, I have my own daughter, I have a son and a daughter, but I have my own children, really thinking about wanting this pattern to stop, and how do I stop that? What became a very urgent idea for me. And so I really wanted to examine all of this, like sort of the mess of love, the mess of family, how to get in there, and how to begin to recognize these patterns in order to then sort of interrupt them moving forward. So the whole manuscript is sort of based on this, trying to show the pattern and question the pattern, and sort of show what's behind these patterns. What are the systems in place that keep these patterns alive? I think there's lots of, it's not just my family or specific to me, but there's, patterns in the political system that would keep things, harder for people to get the help that they need. There's all sorts of structural things that are in place. So it's questioning all of this as it goes on. So it's a big project, but it's what I've been working on for the past 5 to 6 years. And I've put together multiple versions of the book. And just like the poems, I feel like I have to redo the book to sort of make it find its way, so that it's coherent and making sense in the best way possible.
It sounds like a terrific project that really has your heart and soul in this thing for 5 years. But let me ask you about this general question about your poetry style.
Yeah.
And how you would describe it. And what do you want the reader to come away with? Because when I read your poems, I come away with a lot of times surprised.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think that is a large part of what I'm trying to do, is that I think a word that really works for me is wonder. Like, every time I'm trying to approach the topic, it's not that I've understood it, because this is a very complex thing that I'm looking at in my family line. It's not like I noticed this and this is the answer. It's really like, how do I dissect it? How do I make sense of this, sort of like the messiness of this, of what I've been handed down? And so every examination, every poem, it's like approached with sort of like childlike wonder and not having the answer to things. And I think that's where that allows surprise to come in as a writer, is if you don't know what you're going to say yet. Like, I have these notes for, like, maybe I have an image that I know I want to use, but I don't know how it's going to come out. I don't know what's going to happen with that. I don't know how I'm going to make all these things connect. And to me, that's what makes poetry so fun and alive, is that it's an act of discovery. And so if I can bring that to the page, then I think the reader would experience that too. Your favorite poetic elements? Well, I really am interested in sound quality. So it's a little, it can be, sometimes I do ones that are really, really obvious, but usually it's a little more subtle, where I'm thinking about not rhyme, but more off rhyme. So I'm dealing with the way the vowel sounds will mimic each other and making patterns of sounds throughout the poem. So it might sound a little esoteric, but like if you keep making the O sounds, O over again, that can create an idea of wonder, right? So if it's intricately tied to the emotional part, what's happening emotionally in the poem, we tied to what I'm doing with the vowels in that part of the poem. So that is something that I think about and work on as I revise my poems. How about reading another poem, maybe showing that example? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Birthday. We ate burgers bloody, buns toasted in grease, and where teeth split the meat, red dribbled down our chins onto the grass. August and the ghost moon shone without the sun having set. Bees pummeled my head so I'd get up and run, sit down again, slather butter on corn, get up, circle and duck, hand slap thigh, slap foot. The buried cat sprouted a raspberry bush. Nothing with thorns, Maud said, but that bush was an exception. My sister sat calm when a bee brushed her cheek. Like a statue, she said, but the world is a breathing place. Tulips dropped petals and the inner eyes of stalk-stained fingers. That night, we whispered, my sister and I, through grill work, labyrinth of heating ducts that connected us. Ma's love cries echoed through the house. I baked a cake, ransacked the cupboard to cover it in sugared hearts. How sweet it was, feasting like that, alone in the dark. I love that. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there'll be a lot of pattern, like it's hard to describe, like if you have the poem in front of you, you could like start circling the vowel sounds that connect, and then you'll see a very intricate pattern. So I want it to be, it's not that the reader needs to know that, but I think it's something that is felt when you hear it, right? That these things will just come out. And they don't have to be understood or known, but they do the work that they're meant to do. I think I'm going to move to the other room because I think that the internet is sort of going in and out. I'm sorry. No worries.
Since sound is very important to you, do you initially read it silently, and then if the poem interests you, you decide to read it out loud so you get the feeling and the sound, or do you do everything out loud at the very beginning?
When I'm reading somebody else's poem, was that the question?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I originally read it because usually I might not be in a place where I can read it out loud, like if I'm like, in company or on a train or something. I usually read it. I have a pretty loud sound in my head, the sound you hear when you read to yourself. And then when and then I'll start to underline. I write a lot on the poems that I read because I really ask questions of the text to try to learn from them. So like, oh, wow, how is this working? Or, let me connect these sounds together. And then I always read it out loud because things that, seem, you'll miss some of the nuance, even just the pacing of the poem, the rhythm of the poem, where it sort of speeds up. You hear it a lot more clearly when you read it out loud.
Okay. And in your writing process, or as a teacher of poetry, are there resources you recommend to your students or that you yourself use?
Resources in terms, just any resources, or
like practice books or things like that?
Yeah, well, I'm like one of the people that loves the Natalie Goldberg method of writing down the bones. she was actually somebody that Elizabeth Alexander told me when I was an undergrad. Like, she's like, I feel like your poems just need to like burst open. And maybe this goes back to the idea of wonder and surprise, because that method really helps you to stay really in the moment. And so she was like, read this book. And I just remember going and devouring it. And Natalie Goldberg does the great thing where it's like short little sections, and then she'll just say, okay, put the book down right now and write. And I just remember going through, and I just sat in all these cafes on campus, and I would just, I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and it just changed my poetry forever. So I use that practice myself, and I always teach that method to my students. So that's like the go-to for me. And then I do like the Wing Beats books. I don't know if you know those. They have.
I don't, but I'll.
Yeah, they're by. I have them here. They're edited by Scott Wigerman and David. I don't know how to say his last name. Meishin, maybe. There's two of them. But they've got like poets in there that share their teaching poets that share their exercises. And so they not only give like an example poem that's published, but then they show what the students had done in terms of the exercise. And so those are really, they're chock full of things from how to revise or just make new things. There's a lot of craft elements in there that I like to pull from. So those are good resources.
Well, that's great. I think Tim and I both learned a new resource today.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you. Tim.
Hey, I was going to ask you the old question about when a poet or a writer is struggling. I mean, in this weird time of COVID and Trump and sort of the oppression of the world is around you. I've found it hard to write,
Yeah.
and I've definitely read more because I know the writing's not coming. But what are your tips to a writer struggling with block?
Yeah. Again, I would go back to the Goldberg sort of standard, because it's just timed writing. And so when you're really struggling, you can say, okay, I'm just going to do 10 minutes. And 10 minutes is more than, if you're not writing at all, if you feel really blocked, it's something that's manageable to get through. And usually I find that maybe you do 10 minutes for a week and then something bursts, or maybe you just start writing and then you don't want to stop it, but the timer's going to go off, and you don't let yourself stop writing until the timer goes off, but it just gets you through and into like a regular practice. So you pick the time of day. I'm going to be really regimented about it. When I first wake up, I'm going to set the timer. I'm going to write for 10 minutes without stopping, just to get into the habit. And if you can create just like little periods of time that don't seem overwhelming, just to get pen to paper, and know that that's practice, and that some days you're going to feel like you didn't produce anything, that's fine. And other days it will lead to something. And it's all of that work is feeding into something. It doesn't mean that every time you write, you need to create something, worthwhile or meaningful, right? It's just part of the process.
No, that's great advice. And before we're getting towards the end, so before I ask you to read your last two poems, is there anything else you would like to say to the emerging poet?
Yeah, I always just really say, of course, read a lot, but nothing is off limits in terms of what you want to write about. A lot of times we think about, oh, we have to write about love, or we have to write about something really huge or some big idea. And I think that can go back to the idea of feeling stuck, because of everything that's happening in the world feels almost like too much. So how do we, like, you're facing too muchness, and then how do you put that onto paper? And sometimes it doesn't need to be a big thing. It can just be one small little tiny thought that you're trying to examine, and that's a poem in itself. It doesn't have to solve a problem. It doesn't have to do all of it. It's not an essay where it's trying to link several things together. Some of the most beautiful poems are these tiny little poems that just create this moment that sticks with people. So there, and it can be about anything. So I think a lot of the times, you know, starting off, we try to think really big and we have to write something really huge, but all of your lived experience is worthy of examination. And you can write a poem about anything.
Well, how about if we hear two more from you, Ellen?
Great. Okay, I'm going to read Vixen Lessons. It's a short poem. Vixen Lessons. Even dead Aunt Blanche at the dining table seance predicted I'd get killed by a bus. Only Ma said it wasn't so, her flannel robe flapping open in summer. You're fine, she said, fine as a goose down pillow. I cashed a check for my first stilettos on South Salina at the discount store, traipsing kitchen hip swing and tossed back hair, sprayed mint on my tongue, soaked orange peels overnight on the sill. None of them thought I'd turn out right.
That is such a great poem.
Thank you. That was one that came out like boom, you know, like I'm like, what is this? And there it was.
I mean, you have your sound going on. You have your rhythm. You have your wonder in that poem. You have you have everything.
Thank you. And then this one is called Prayer. My daughter filled a shoebox with dead wasps, leaf blankets, cut needles shot from pine, painted the cupboard black to keep the light inside. It was a good day, an ice cube tray full and cracked and split, the water shaped to hold in our mouths. There was no treasure. Cool liquid slid down our throats in the garden. I quizzed her for her biology final, all alveoli and exchange of oxygen. Tomato plants hummed, fledglings squawked for their mama's return, and the sun blazed dewdrops to extinction. World spinning through dark and dark itself spiraling, yes, spiraling through the void. Future world with both of us gone that from a distance shone like a star. Science, do not forsake us. Pretend dying won't be inglorious and hard, that will reflect light like gowns, sequined and glittering, various and continual, shouting out over time our urgent, unimpeded burning.
Ellen, that's wonderful. Can you tell the listeners how to get a hold of your collections that are out there?
Yeah, SPD is the best place to go. That's the small press distribution. So that's where my full-length collection, Histories of the Future Perfect, is. It's also on Amazon, but I like to support the small press. And then Avalanche Tunnel is a free download on the Ryga website. That's RYGA, but they also have limited edition. They're all like hand numbered. If you want a hard copy, you can order it directly from them. It's on the website if you just look up Avalanche Tunnel.
Brother Al.
Yes. Well, it's been a delightful interview and a delightful read. The poem, and I'm forgetting the name, about the hamburger that starts about eating a
Birthday, right? Yeah.
Yes, and a rare hamburger is it was a wonderful piece. It was not saying the other ones weren't wonderful, but I really enjoyed that one.
Thank you.
We want to thank the poet Ellen Kombiyil, and we encourage you to look her up and learn more about what she has to offer. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just been delightful spending time talking poetry. I love it.